Delhi, Pages from a Forgotten History, looks at something that people in India don't really think about that much today, which is the incredible cultural heritage of the Persian language in India, which has been with us for about 800 years, and really connected India to the rest of Asia, a vast part of the world, from Turkey across Central Asia to China, and all of India, where Persian was the language of high culture, and of letter writing, of administration. And so it was the one language that really could carry through most of Asia. And today we think of it as a foreign language, the language of Iran, of Afghanistan, Tajikistan. But in fact, 300 years ago, it was considered an Indian language. And Indians who were in the administration, and even humble people like village officials were educated in Persian. And what I've done in my book is I've traced the history from the very beginning, all the way up to the present day, because it's not really a living tradition anymore, but there are still echoes of it. There are people who are alive who were educated in Persian before independence. There are people who claim to remember Persian poetry, although it's actually years of misremembering have really turned it into Urdu. So that's my book. It's a bit of storytelling, a lot of literary material, and it's really just about recovering this lost culture. Right. Well, my background is strange because I'm an American. I work in England now, and I study India. So I'm in many different countries at the same time. Basically, I started studying Western literature. I started as a scholar of Latin, and I realized that the thing that really interested me was why an old text would be picked up by generation after generation and remade into something that contemporary people could use. Because after all, paper falls apart, things have to be copied, and if they're not copied, then they're lost. And I came to Delhi for the first time 11 years ago as the guest of a friend of mine, and when I first heard someone on the street quote a story from the Mahabharata, I realized that this is what I was looking for. The fact that there's a great classical culture that still somehow survives. Now, years later, my project changed from one focusing on Sanskrit and Hindi to one that looked at Persian and Urdu. But the same idea is there of looking, really thinking about why certain texts are fundamental, and how a literary culture renews itself. And that's why, as I said, it's very important for me to make the point that 300 years ago, Persian was an Indian language for all intents and purposes, even if it doesn't seem that way to us today. But I'm a historian, so I'm interested in promoting the understanding of history. But it's important to recover these things. My book is anchored in Delhi because I really wanted to give people a place that they could think about. I visit places like the Dargah of Hazrat Nizamuddin, where the Qawwals still every Thursday when they sing will usually include a Persian song or two. So I wanted to make sure that it was anchored in a place. But it is true that Delhi was the focus of Persian culture in India for most of the time that we've had Persian culture here. The Delhi Sultanate, of course, they promoted Persian quite heavily. Amir Khusro was from Delhi. The Mughals had many different capitals. They were shuttling between Lahore, Agra, and Delhi, but Delhi, I could still focus the story on Delhi. Yeah. So he was also a very good Arabist. He wrote a preface to a Persian book in Arabic, which was quite remarkable, and that shows the way in which this culture. today we think of Persian as a Muslim language. We think of Urdu as a Muslim language. But in the 18th century, there were more Hindus actually learning Persian than Muslims. And so it's a great sort of, it's a bit anachronistic to call it secularism, but that's really what it was. People from different communities having a space where they could meet together and respect one another. And it's, for us to forget that is really, it's practically criminal. I don't know. Well, both. The connection of India to the larger Persian world, it was economic, it was military. There was a vast trade in things like horses. You couldn't raise horses in India, so you'd have to get them from Central Asia. And there were very large Indian communities actually in all of the major cities in Afghanistan and Iran. And so you have the Persian coming from that side, but also when successive rulers made it an administrative language, just like English is today in India a language of striving for something better, Persian was also a way for people to essentially better their state, and they were very keen on what we would think of as a literary education, because the way in which people communicated was much more at the level of poetry and criticism than we're familiar with today. The court had to have poets because poets were seen as a way of spreading the ruler's good name around, and also as someone who could provide counsel to the ruler and to the ministers in this roundabout way, not saying you should do this, you should do that, which you can't do for a king, but by presenting an idea contained within a poem or something like that. So poetry and administration and the exercise of power were all connected. And it also had a military function as well, because the military was how rulers physically exercised their power. It looks at the vast sweep of Persian India. It's, you can really start at the very beginning when the Indian languages that we have today and the languages of the Persian-based languages were essentially the same language, and they split off. That would have been something like, scholars argue about it, but that would have been something like 3,000 years ago. So I start all the way back there just to say that there is this connection which remarkably was rediscovered by Indian Persian writers in the 18th century. The connection between Old Persian and Sanskrit was addressed by an 18th century scholar called Khane Arzu, who happens to be the title of my the subject of my PhD thesis. So it's a little dangerous for me to talk about him because I know far too much. But you can see these ways in which the culture is absolutely continuous and is always increasing. Many more people were learning Persian in the 18th century than were learning Persian in the 17th century, than were learning Persian in the 16th century. And as I said, because it was the language of aspiration, it was something that more and more people tried to be involved with. And even the British, when they came, Persian was their way of understanding India. So the Mughals had done these translations into Persian from Sanskrit. So something called the Razmnameh, the Book of War, that is a translation of sections of the Mahabharata. And so when the British couldn't read Sanskrit, they actually read these Persian translations, and that was their first sense. Or the translations of the Upanishads that were done for Dara Shikoh, who was then horribly killed by his brother Aurangzeb. That was the way that the British first learned about Hinduism. And we think of this as a sort of a historical dead end, because of course then the British learned Sanskrit, and then a lot of what they thought they knew turned out to be wrong. But I'm very interested in this transition period when the colonial state thought it was very important to engage with Persian, and because it was a language of communication across regions, it meant that they had to have an enormous office full of munchis who just maintained all the communication with all of these Indian principalities who sent their sent their letters back and forth in Persian. No, I don't, except for maybe a few paragraphs. What's more important, and more interesting is not the actual similarity, but just the fact that someone noticed it in the 18th century before there was a Western discipline of historical linguistics. And it just shows that there was this incredible scholarly tradition in India, even when people in Iran were not very interested in such things. The Indian critics, even some Iranians today will admit that the Indian critics by the 18th century were so much better than the Iranians because they were thinking so deeply. And because this first generation of Urdu writers was also this generation of great critics in Persian. So there's a connection to the modern vernacular languages in that the people who were really seriously thinking about what Urdu should be in the mid-18th century were also the same people who were thinking deeply about standard Persian and how different regions of the Persian world relate to one another, and really what the fundamental purpose of poetry is. So it's amazing that all of this happened before the colonial period, before, it was very much like things that were happening in the West at the same time. But at the same time, it was a completely independent development, and one that was forgotten because it didn't. For the British, this was literary criticism. It's not linguistics. It can't teach us about the language, which is completely false. This was the way in which Indians taught each other Persian, the way in which they appreciated Persian, and also it was very deeply connected to the administration, because if you were going to be an administrator back then, you had to be cultured. You had to prove that you shared the same values as the people around you. And what better way than through a rich poetic culture? It should be out by the end of the year. I don't have a firm commitment as to when they'll bring it out, but it should be quite soon. It's with them. They're laying it out. It's just over 100,000 words. Well, this was the struggle. It was always meant to be for the layman, but it's a subject that doesn't sound like something that ordinary people would be interested in. So I've filled it with anecdotes. I've made it readable, which is unusual for an academic author, I think, because in academia we're rewarded for being as obscure as possible. But I was actually writing it at the same time as my PhD thesis. It was an escape from me because on the one side I would be writing my my complicated academic stuff, and then on the other side I could just tell stories. So we'll see who actually reads the book, but I'm hoping that it's well researched enough that academics will appreciate it, especially because I don't think anyone has ever written a book that traces this history really from the beginning to the end, as I've said. But also, I tried very hard to make it interesting.